In May 1940, the German army invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and then France, which capitulated on the 21st of June. The Nazi occupation was harsh. Fuel and food were rationed. Many people suffered and died, and after 4 years of occupation, the French people yearned for liberation.
Life
under occupation was very hard. We always had to pay attention when we would talk. We did not know if someone was going to betray you. There were no sweets, no treats, no chocolate, none. Every child had 200 grams of bread per day.
The consequences for not cooperating with the German occupation could be at times severe. On the lower end of the scale was forced deportation. On the higher end, though, for more extreme offenses, it could be death, summary execution.
On espérait, oui, que quelqu'un vienne. On savait pas trop, mais il le disait.
People said, maybe the Americans will come to liberate us. We were hoping.
Nous aider.
The first forces in action on D-Day were the airborne units who were dropped over Normandy.
The planes carrying the paratroopers were to approach the Cotentin Peninsula from the west and drop the paratroopers into Normandy starting at about 1 a.m. Their overall mission was to drop behind enemy lines, seize beach exits, causeways, and capture key transportation and communication points. Their main goal was to block the German counterattacks against the Allied invasion force coming ashore at dawn on the beaches of Normandy.
On the 5th of June, members of the 507th prepared for the invasion jump.
I had the switchboard strapped to the front of my legs, and my musette bag was there. The parachute was on the back, and the reserve chute was on the front.
And there were bundles of equipment. Inside each were mortar tubes, 30 caliber machine guns, ammunition, tripods, and landmines. The bundles were about 8 feet long and hung from the undercarriage of the aircraft. Each had its own parachute and was released before the men jumped. Pathfinder teams jumped first to mark the drop zones with lights. The main airborne assault force of the 82nd and the 101st took off late on the night of the 5th of June. 13,000 men descended from the sky. The 2,000 men of the 507th alone filled 117 aeroplanes.
We started out over the water, and looking down through the breaks in the clouds, you could see all these ships as far as the eye could see. And naturally, you had thoughts of home, your loved ones, and the experience that you were going to have.
I know some men tried to sleep, and at least they were quiet. I certainly didn't.
I remember a very bright flashing light, and then the planes made a 45-degree angle and came back over the Normandy Peninsula. We encountered very heavy anti-aircraft fire.
Almost immediately thereafter, we hit the fog bank.
As the planes approached Normandy, the meticulously planned operation began to unravel. Some pilots chose to fly above the clouds, others below. A barrage of anti-aircraft fire peppered the oncoming aircraft with shrapnel.
I can remember vividly an aircraft on my right, perhaps a half a mile away, that took a direct hit and was coming straight down in flames, and I can remember saying a little prayer, hoping that these paratroopers all got out alive.
When they emerged from the fog bank, the surviving aircraft carrying the 507th were scattered far off course. They couldn't see the drop zones. The pilots tried to slow the engines to the speed of 90 miles per hour as they approached the target to allow the paratroopers to jump, but the plane started to vibrate and go out of control. The men waited for the green light. In less than half a minute, a group of 16 paratroopers, which was known as a stick, descended from the plane. Most of the C-47s carrying the 507th had dropped their men north of Carentan. 10 sticks landed 25 miles south of the drop zone, near the village of Grenier. The regiment was spread out over 60 square miles. Germans were everywhere. Corpses littered the ground. Many of those unlucky enough to get caught in trees or on buildings were simply shot. Intelligence had shown that the Germans had closed the locks at La Baquette in order to flood the low-lying marshland all around. The tall reeds growing in the water fooled the intelligence analysts into thinking that the boggy areas were just a few inches deep.
About that time I was hitting what I expected to be an open field, and I came down in water up to about mid-thigh.
I landed at about 5 feet of water. It was up to my shoulders. I had to get out of that parachute real quick.
Many of the 507th landed in the canals that cut through the marshes. Weighed down with heavy equipment, some became entangled in their parachutes and were unable to swim free. The survivors of the drop were scattered over several miles, cut off from their command and far from their objective. Their mission could fail completely. They needed help, badly.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Een onafhankelijkheidsverklaring.
We took on the greatest superpower of the time.
Een natie herenigd.
The British Army was fighting for a king. The Americans were fighting for their lives.
Een nieuw begin.
It gives you a sense of how much they wanted freedom.
De indrukwekkende nieuwe serie America. The Story of the US. Vanavond om 8 uur op History. Wat blijft er over als wij er niet meer zijn? Life After People vervolgt elke maandag om 8 uur op History.
In the early hours of D-Day, 182 men of the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment were dropped in Normandy, 20 miles from their target. Some were shot by German soldiers. Others drowned in canals and marshes. The survivors had to reorganize themselves in the dark. As the 507th began to emerge from the marshes, they were wet, tired, and hungry. To survive and complete their mission, they had to regroup as soon as possible. It seemed a near impossible task.
Our equipment bundles sunk into the water, so it was very difficult to find them. And we didn't know where we were. We could see in the distance a church steeple with a cross on it. And I figured that had to be a village on high ground, so we started to make our way towards this village.
The landmark that drew John Hinchcliffe was the cross on the 12th century Catholic church in the village of Grenier, a small community of about 200 dwellings. It was surrounded on 3 sides by the flooded lowlands. Close to the village was a farm owned by the Rigaud family.
The Rigaud farm sat on the edge of a large open meadow, which at the time was inundated. It was a flooded area, so it was more like a marsh. As the aircraft passed overhead, the family was awakened by the noise.
It was 1:20 in the morning when the first paratrooper knocked at the door. They checked his map and realized they were in the wrong place. They were very disappointed.
The Rigaud family showed him that he was well off the edge of the map. He realized then that he'd landed in the wrong place.
Well, since he was all soaked, he took his attire off, the main stuff, then emptied his pockets. He took out a piece of chocolate, something we hadn't seen in ages. It was the first American chocolate treat.
Shortly before dawn, there was another knock at the door, and then a man speaking perfect French saying, "Don't be afraid, open the door." It was Corporal Benton J. Broussard of the 507th Regiment. A French-Canadian by birth, he was a fluent French speaker. This would prove of immense value over the next few days.
At dawn, all the Americans showed up in the courtyard. We counted about 120. My father told me that I had better milk the cows now, because at daybreak they would be fighting with the Germans. So I picked up my jug and went on my way.
I went there with my sister, Odette. I saw something fall down in the swamp.
All of a sudden, there were bursts of gunfire. The Americans took me home right away.
Corporal Broussard took the girls back to the safety of the farm. He would protect the sisters for the next 6 days. In the first light of dawn, small groups of soldiers made their way out of the marsh and into the village.
Let's go.
By 10 o'clock, 25 paratroopers under the command of Captain Dave Brummett arrived. Major Charles Johnson led another group, which also included Lieutenant Frank Norton and Captain Abraham Sofiane Jr., the battalion surgeon. By the afternoon, 182 Americans had gathered in Grenier.
With Corporal Broussard and Captain Sofiane serving as translators, Major Johnson began to communicate with Mayor Alphonse Voidy. Major Johnson wanted to know about German troop movements in the area. He also wanted to know a little bit about the general layout of the land immediately around Grenier. Without hesitating, the mayor and a number of other citizens of the village began to give Major Johnson everything he wanted.
Major Johnson faced a momentous decision. Should he take his band of 180 men and push back across the marshes to Carentan, back to where their mission objective was? Or do they stay in Grenier and build defenses and take control of a city that sits astride one of the major arteries for German troops headed towards the Battle of Carentan?
I was present when Major Johnson and Captain Brummett were discussing the possibility of moving that very night that we came in there.
Captain Brummett favored the idea of getting the men out of Grenier.
Well, the idea of heading back towards Carentan had many drawbacks. All of the heavy equipment, the 81mm mortars, could not be carried through the marshes, so they'd have to be destroyed. The deep canals cutting through the swamp would require the soldiers to swim or find small fishing boats. This alternate plan would require probably a 2-day journey without food, vulnerable to German counterattacks. And when they got there, then they'd have to find some way of making it through American lines.
Captain Brummett did not press the issue at that time. It was very apparent that Major Johnson had made up his mind that we would not move that night.
The decision was final. A small band of American paratroopers would stay and defend Grenier. The villagers, at great risk to their own lives, enthusiastically joined the cause.
De opdracht van Terry Shepard.
I'm in a different part of the world. This is a Maya war club.
Onderzoek de tactieken en training.
You have to move quickly, because this is a razor coming to take your life.
Van de meest beruchte krijgers uit de geschiedenis.
Launch the spears, the fight is on.
Warriors. Elke donderdag om 8:55 op History. De geschiedenis kent vele onopgeloste mysteries.
There are still many unanswered questions.
Kan de wetenschap ons helpen om ze op te lossen?
Allow the data to carry us to a conclusion.
In Mystery Quest onderzoeken we elke week een nieuw mysterie om achter de waarheid te komen.
This is pretty phenomenal stuff.
We're going to change everybody's perception.
It's a quest. It's a personal quest.
Mystery Quest. Volgende week donderdag om 8:00.
Soaking wet, exhausted and hungry, 182 American paratroopers were welcomed as liberators by the people of the French village of Gragne. However, the Germans were all around them.
To defend the village of Gragne, the remnants of the paratroopers had to accomplish a couple of goals. First of which was to set up their perimeter to guard the approaches to the village. They also had to secure a food supply. Most important, of course, they had to collect their missing weapons and the bundles lying out there in the marshes. For these last two, they needed the help of the people of Gragne.
The mayor called a meeting at the church the next day, the 7th of June. He appealed to the people of Gragne to place all the resources of the village at the disposal of the Americans.
Les officiers américains, en voilà deux ici, hein.
What the mayor was asking them to do was turn their peaceful village into a battleground. If the Germans even suspected them of aiding the enemy, no one in Gragne would be safe. Despite the enormous risks, the villagers voted unanimously to help the paratroopers.
Mayor Voidy sought the assistance of Madame Germaine Boursier. She owned the local village grocery and cafe. She would organize and would administer the daily preparation of food. She served 2 hot meals a day.
Well, I always regarded her as that one indispensable asset to any military organization, the mess sergeant.
Bonjour.
Hello. Delivery of the meals was handled by some of the women of the village, but then also by their children.
Good, merci, thanks.
Coming up with the correct amount of food to feed these American paratroopers was a big challenge to Madame Boursier because the food was, of course, rationed. She would travel to nearby villages each day. She would come up with imaginary reasons for her needs for additional food, and then she would conceal the additional food that she would then take back into Gragne.
Merci beaucoup. Je leur donnerai. Au revoir. Au revoir.
The mayor also organized the crucial task of retrieving the bundles of equipment from the marshes.
The act of going out into the swamps to collect the equipment bundles was something that for the French was very, very dangerous. If they were observed by the Germans engaged in this activity, they would have been summarily executed.
Two American paratroopers asked me if I could bring the ammunition into town so they could defend us from the Germans. The Americans put all the mines and ammunition into my cart. At 50 to 100 meters, about halfway, my father asked me where I was going. I said I was bringing ammunition to the Americans. He told me not to, because the Germans were coming from everywhere. I left the cart with the 3 Americans.
The sisters also collected the white silk parachutes from the equipment bundles in the hope of one day making dresses out of them.
There were parachutes all over the place. We also found ammunition. We put our items into a cart and continued scavenging all day long. We finished our day by putting everything into the barn close by.
The French were bringing in weapons, and of course they were still feeding us. I was impressed by that, but I still didn't realize exactly the extent of it, and nor did I know the individuals who were involved. That came many years later.
The scavenging was so successful, the Americans soon had ample supplies of weapons and ammunition to defend the village.
Thank you, thank you.
Well, some of the patrols began to notice a steady increase of enemy traffic on the north-south road to Carentan. It wasn't long before somebody got too close and the shooting started.
The Germans kept throwing a few patrols into it. We kept knocking them off, and the patrols were getting larger.
4 days into the invasion, the paratroopers had their first direct contact with a German reconnaissance patrol. In examining the identification papers of the dead German soldiers, the Americans made a worrying discovery. An entire Panzer Grenadier division, comprising thousands of German mechanized infantrymen, was very close to them.
These small firefights confirmed for the Germans that the Americans were indeed in Grania. The question then became, how many?
A full-scale German attack appeared to be imminent. In readiness for it, Major Johnson ordered the demolition squad to destroy the bridge at La Porte des Planques, a short distance north of the village. It was strategically important because the Germans could use it to retreat from Carentan or to attack Grenia through the marshes.
We had a full squad of the demolition platoon, and Sergeant Murray was the demolition sergeant, a wonderful NCO. When we got to the bridge, Sergeant Murray looked it over, and I said, all right, how long is this going to take? He said, 30 minutes, sir. I can have it.
Lieutenant Norton ordered Sergeant Frank Costa and Private David Purcell to cross over to the north side and provide cover while the explosives were set in place.
As fate would have it, there was approximately a German platoon. I'll never know for sure, but they weren't too sharp. They exposed themselves.
Costa sent Purcell back to warn the village, then homed in on the enemy. When the Germans were about 500 yards from the bridge, Costa opened fire.
Lieutenant Norton, we both stood in the road and we fired our guns, but the bridge was that way. So all the bullets went up. And I don't think we hit a German over there.
Well, it's kind of funny now, but it wasn't quite that funny then. They started firing like mad, indiscriminately. They didn't know what they were shooting at either. Within a minute of Sergeant Murray's estimated time of 30 minutes, he had that bridge wired.
And then Norton gave us the order to blow the bridge.
Blow it!
And boy, that thing went up, and then the concrete came down, and the metal came down, and then we knew we were safe.
Lieutenant Norton and his men had just achieved an important military objective, but they had also exposed their position to an entire division of the German army. American paratroopers and French civilians alike would soon learn just how large a force of Germans that was. The reckoning was at hand.
Get somebody out there. My God, he's big.
Something is touching the top of the tent.
This noise was like nothing I've heard before.
I found 14.5-inch footprints.
Something mysterious is out there.
What's that coming over the hill? Is it a monster? Is it a monster? Is it a monster?
Monster Quest. Elke donderdag om 10 voor 10 op History.
My name's Ken Hames, and I served in the British Army for almost all my life. And now I'm on a voyage of discovery to find out the history of Scots at war.
Schotse soldaten werden door de eeuwen heen gevreesd en gerespecteerd. In een nieuwe serie treedt Ken Hames in het spoor van hun roemrijk verleden en gaat met ze mee naar Afghanistan.
It's been the hardest fighting possibly since Korea.
Scots at War. Binnenkort op History.
A small group of American paratroopers, aided by the local people, was dug in ready to defend the village of Grenier. They were surrounded by a massive German force. The morning of the 11th of June dawned bright and calm. War seemed very far away in the tranquility of this, the first Sunday after the invasion.
The major had permitted a number of men to go to Mass, those who were Roman Catholic. I am a Roman Catholic, and I was there.
Martha and Odette Rigaud went to Mass. They did not go with their mother and father. They were escorted to Mass by Corporal Benton Broussard, the French-speaking paratrooper.
We saw him during the week, and he kept reminding us that he would come and get us to go to Mass. We waited, and he came. He was such a charming boy.
Leaving the house at 9:30, the girls arrived just as Father Le Blestier began to say Mass.
Au nom du Père, du Fils, du Saint-Esprit. Amen. Notre Père qui es aux cieux, que ta volonté soit faite sur la terre comme au ciel.
Whether by coincidence or design, the Germans picked that very moment to begin their first assault on the village. The priest tried to carry on, but suddenly someone burst into the church.
Miss Bazir was a woman who lived right by the church with her children. She saw the Germans coming. She ran to the church and told us to run away. The Germans were so close.
Sergeant Hinchcliffe was one of the soldiers inside the church.
I ran out of the church and over to my machine gun position, which was roughly a quarter of a mile or so away on the edge of the town. They hit us with what we estimated to be a regiment between 2,000 and 3,000 men.
The Germans now outnumber the Americans 10 to 1.
A large number of parishioners were still inside the church. They couldn't leave because there were hundreds of bullets literally flying around the center of the village during the firefight.
My sister and I went to spots within the church where the columns were the thickest so we could protect ourselves.
The assault lasted only 10 minutes. It was a poorly organized and badly coordinated attack, and the paratroopers were able to inflict heavy casualties on the assailants.
With wholesale slaughter, we eliminated a whole heck of a lot of Germans there, and they retreated.
During this lull, some of the parishioners in the church decided to leave the village, only to be sucked into the ugly reality of the situation. The Germans forced these people to help load their dead and wounded into trucks. Although the American firepower had repulsed them in the first round, the Germans did not give up. Round 2 was about to commence.
At about 2 p.m., the Germans unleashed a fearsome mortar barrage of the town of Grenier. As soon as that bombardment lifted, a second wave of infantry came in to assault the flanks of the perimeter. These attackers came on so quickly that they almost breached the perimeter at one point. Captain Brummett was able to shift his forces, though, to meet that threat, and the line held.
They hit us again in the afternoon. It was the same thing. We did a real number on them, killed a lot of people, but we're starting to run low on ammunition.
The casualties were all taken to the church in the center of the village, where they were cared for primarily by Captain Sophia, who was an actual medical doctor. They were also cared for by the two Catholic priests, Father Le Blastier and Father Le Barbachon.
Like the eye of the hurricane, Grenier was ominously quiet following the second attack. Major Johnson used the lull in fighting to bring his outposts closer in. Since all the evidence indicated the probability of an even bigger German attack at any time, Major Johnson ordered all the inhabitants of Grenier away from the center of the village.
He felt really sad. He said that the situation was really serious because of the lack of ammunition. We had to run away quickly, family by family.
It hurt to let them go away. We tried to kiss and hug as many as we could with the hope of seeing them again.
After their 9 hours of confinement in the church, the girls said their goodbyes and went home to the farm. At the same time, lookouts in the belfry saw a daunting sight. The Germans could be seen setting up 2 88mm artillery pieces. Lieutenant Pip Reed, who had designed the village defenses, tried to persuade the lookouts to abandon their position, but they insisted on staying up there. The men made several attempts to direct mortar fire onto the German guns, but they were out of range. And the Americans had run out of time. The Germans opened fire on the church.
When the shell hit, I mean, you could hear it, ping, ping, and boy, they really demolished that church.
Major Johnson was an early victim of the barrage when a shell tore through the command post. After softening up the defenses with artillery and mortar fire, 2,000 German soldiers moved inexorably towards the village. With the loss of the observation post in the belfry, the Americans could no longer deploy their long-range mortar fire.
We were under heavy fire. It was obvious that we were not going to be able to hold.
After darkness fell, the conflict became confused. Both sides fired blindly at each other, but the number of casualties among the paratroopers began to rise. For 6 days, a group of French villagers and a small force of US paratroopers prevented the German army from reclaiming Grenier. But the ever-growing number of German troops and the ever-decreasing amount of American ammunition began to take a toll.
With Major Johnson dead, command of the force defending Grenier devolved to Captain Dave Brummett, the man that had opposed remaining in Grenier to begin with.
Captain Brummett gave the order for his men to retreat. But they were overrun so fast that organized resistance collapsed, and the surviving paratroopers had no choice but to flee. Captain Sofiane chose to stay behind to care for the wounded, hoping they would receive honorable treatment as POWs.
We certainly had to get out of town, to go back to the swamp.
For a whole day, the paratroopers engaged more than 2,000 German troops, killing an estimated 500 and wounding hundreds more. Then the weary remnants of the original 182 Americans began to slip away from the village into the night. The battle for Grenier had ended, but tragically, the killing had only just begun. Finally, German troops overran the village. The Nazis' brutal retaliation then began.
During the final attack for the Rigaud family on their farm at the Port Saint-Pierre, just a few kilometers away from Gragny, they could hear the sounds of the battle raging up in the village.
A red flare was the signal for the American paratroopers to retreat.
That's when we had to get out of town. And they said, every man for himself.
Lieutenant Frank Norton managed to get 23 men out of the village by leading them in an all-night march towards the southeast.
There was only one place for us to go, to get as far out in the swamp as we could.
Up early on the farm as usual, Odette Rigaud spotted an escaping American and offered help.
I told him that the Germans were everywhere. I motioned him to move quickly into the barn, since I didn't speak any English.
Her sister, Martha, also encountered some escaping paratroopers.
I found him by the well. I took him to the barn and found out my sister had been hiding some soldiers there.
Martha and Odette were reluctant to tell their parents what they were doing.
The Germans were sure to be searching the entire area, looking for the Americans that had imposed such heavy casualties on them at Gragny. And if the Rigaud family was found to be giving any assistance whatsoever to those Americans, it was an almost guarantee that everyone in the family would be killed.
Paratroopers continued to limp into the Rigaud's farm throughout the next 2 days. The number finally reached a total of 21, all of them from the 507th.
Sudden appearance of these 21 house guests placed a strain on the family's food situation. Just as the village had to resort to creative means of feeding the paratroopers the week before, the Rigaud family had to do the same.
Fearing that the Germans were watching the farm, the girls crammed food into a milk churn to appear as if they were going about their normal milking tasks, and then they left it for the men to retrieve later. The paratroopers had to be careful not to make any noise. Talking was kept to an absolute minimum. Time seemed to pass very slowly. On the 12th of June, the 101st Airborne Division captured Carentan. If the Germans had not been stopped at Gragny, the battle for the town would have lasted longer and been much more costly.
The Americans, and certainly the Rigaud family, hoped that the Allies would sweep south into their area. But after 2 days, it began to dawn on them that the 101st could be consolidating its positions around Carentan. A breakthrough might be days, even weeks away.
On the 15th of June, 2 Germans arrived at the farm. They were looking for Americans.
The 2 Germans approached the barn, they kicked the doors open and searched the lower level. And right at the moment where they were about to search the upper level, they turned and left.
Everyone decided that the best thing to do was for the Americans to attempt to reach Carentan.
The paratroopers could not use the roads. Those were sure to be clogged with Germans. So they would have to make their way to Carentan through the marshes.
Monsieur Rigaud found a boat to take the soldiers through the marsh. His family, who had assisted over 70 American paratroopers to escape, said farewell. Unfortunately, not everyone in Gragny was so fortunate. Once the Germans had overrun the village, a group of SS men entered the priest's house. They knew the church had been of enormous help to the Americans. The SS shot Father Le Blestier and Father Le Barbachon. Even the housekeepers were not spared. The wounded paratroopers were about to receive the same fate. The enraged German soldiers stormed the first aid station in the church and forced the wounded and their doctor, Captain Sofiane, outside.
One group of 5 was led down to the edge of the marsh behind Madame Bouchier's cafe.
Halt!
Those 5 men were bayoneted and shot and dumped in the water.
Another group of the wounded was frog-marched south, out of the village. The Germans commanded the men to dig a pit before they shot each of them in the head. A total of 44 villagers were rounded up and interrogated by the Germans as suspected collaborators. They were threatened with execution if they didn't surrender the names of all the villagers who had helped the Americans.
Those civilians, they had perfect solidarity. They didn't offer a single name.
Go! Now!
Their lives were spared when a German officer decided that enough blood had already been spilt. To the end, no names were revealed. Most of the villagers, including Madame Boursier and the mayor, Monsieur Voidy, took refuge in the outlying farms and the homes of their friends. The following day, the Germans ransacked Grenier and set fire to the church. The blaze spread to the rest of the village. Of the 200 or so buildings, only 2 survived intact. When Allied forces finally liberated the area during July, a graves registration unit was sent to Grenier and the nearby village of Hemmerve to recover the corpses of the victims. The exhumation at Hemmerve was filmed to provide documentary evidence for future war crimes trials. 20 people were executed at Grenier. 7 paratroopers were killed at Hemmerve. In all, 32 paratroopers lost their lives at Grenier.
But the 32 Americans that were killed during the battle at Grenier, I think it's very important to remember that not a single one of those men was there forcibly. Every single one of them had volunteered. There were only volunteers in the parachute infantry.
The most powerful weapon that the paratroopers had may not have been their 81mm mortars or even their .30 caliber machine guns. It was the promise of freedom. When they walked into that village on June 6th, they were vulnerable. The people of Grenier threw open their doors and gave their liberators everything they had: medical aid, intelligence, food, shelter.
The paratroopers, the priests, and their housekeepers were not the only lives lost at Grenier. 28 villagers died during the battle. After the war, the ruins of the church were turned into a memorial where the names of those who gave their lives for liberty are forever enshrined. In 1986, Martha and Odette joined veterans of the 507th in a very special ceremony. Along with 9 other villagers, they received the Award for Distinguished Civilian Service, the highest honor the United States can bestow on a civilian.
We appreciated the valor and the sacrifices that they had made in our behalf and, of course, for their country. They were and are remarkable people.
Martha and Odette Rigaud, whose acts of heroism were finally acknowledged, possessed something more tangible in their memories of their roles in the Battle of Grenier. The fine white silk of the parachutes they collected from the marsh was put to good use. The fragile silk that had carried the men of the 507th in their deadly descent through hellfire on D-Day were transformed into Martha's first communion dress, and shortly after the war, Odette's wedding gown.
When you are a child and you have no freedom, it's wonderful when you get it all back. You don't forget.
Those of us who lived with the experience of war, you'll never forget. They were our liberators.
These truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Een onafhankelijkheidsverklaring.
We took on the greatest superpower of the time.
Een natie herenigd.
The British Army was fighting for a king. The Americans were fighting for their lives.
Een nieuw begin.
It gives you a sense of how much they wanted freedom.
De indrukwekkende nieuwe serie America. The Story of the US. Vanavond om 8 uur op History.
Klimaatverandering is geen nieuw verschijnsel. De gevolgen ervan waren